What would you do if the town that threw you out at 18 sold you its biggest ranch 4 years later for the two crumpled dollars still folded in your coat pocket? Jane Walker rode back into Dry Creek at 22 with nothing but a bedroll, a borrowed mare, and a name the town had tried to forget. By sundown the next day, the courthouse clerk would stamp a deed in her hand for 1,000 acres of cattle country that a powerful family had let rot. But what was waiting beneath the floorboards of that ruined ranch house would rewrite her blood, her town, and the man who had once run her out. Settle in. Let us know where you're watching from. This is a long ride, and the truth is buried deep. The wind found her first. It came down off the ridge the way it always had, dry and full of grit, tugging at the brim of her hat as the mare crested the low rise above town. Dry Creek lay below her the way she remembered it, a scatter of tin roofs and plank walls strung along a road the color of ash. The church still leaned a little to the east. The livery still had that black scar on its south wall where a lantern had fallen when she was 12. The bell over the mercantile still hung crooked. 4 years, and nothing had shifted an inch. Jane sat the mare a long moment before she nudged her forward. Her coat was thinner than the weather asked for. Her boots were split along one heel. In the inner pocket, folded twice against her chest, were 2 paper dollars soft as cloth from being carried without being spent. She had earned them in Cheyenne, scrubbing floors in a boarding house through a winter she did not care to remember. They were all she owned. She had not planned to come back. She had planned to keep going west until the country ran out of west, but her mother had died in April, alone, in a room above a laundry 200 miles from any grave that carried her name. And something in Jane had turned around like a horse smelling home. Grief did that. It did not ask permission. At the edge of town, a boy on a fence post watched her pass. His mouth opened and closed. He hopped down and ran. She let him run. Word would move faster than she could. By the time she tied the mare at the trough outside the courthouse, 3 men were already standing on the boardwalk watching her without pretending not to. She knew 2 of them. The third she did not, and he was the one whose eyes stayed on her longest. She touched the mare's neck once, quietly, the way a person touches a friend before going into a room they might not walk out of. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper and lamp oil. The clerk was a narrow man with ink on his knuckles. He looked up, blinked, and set his pen down slowly, the way a person sets down something breakable. Miss Walker, he said. Sir. You come back. I have. He glanced toward the door behind her, then leaned an inch closer over the counter. What can this office do for you? Jane laid the $2 on the wood between them. They looked very small there, and very tired. The old Halloran place, she said. I heard it's for auction? The clerk's face did a strange, careful thing. It went still, then softer, then still again. He looked at the money, he looked at her, he looked at the door. That ranch, he said, has been on the tax rolls 7 years unpaid. The county set the minimum bid at $1 to be rid of it. No one has come. He wet his lips. No one has come, Miss Walker, because of who used to own it. You understand? I understand. $2 would buy it twice. Then I'll buy it twice, Jane said. He looked at her a long time. Then he took up his pen. Outside on the boardwalk, the third man had not moved. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and wore a coat cut better than any coat in Dry Creek had a right to be. When Jane stepped back into the light with the folded deed inside her coat, he laughed. It was not a small laugh. It was the kind of laugh a man uses to make sure the street hears him. $2. he said, "for 1,000 acres of rattlesnakes and rot." Jane did not look at him. She untied the mare. "Girl," he called louder, "you know what you just bought? You bought a graveyard with a barn on it. You bought the reason your daddy left this town in a box." Her hand paused on the rein, just for a breath. Then she swung up into the saddle. "Ride out there," he said, still smiling. "See how long you last. The land'll take those $2 back before the moon's full." She turned the mare north, toward the ridge road, and did not answer him. Behind her, the laughter of 2 or 3 others joined his, thin in the wind. An old woman on the church steps watched Jane pass, and did not laugh. Her mouth moved once, silently, as if she were saying a prayer or a warning, and Jane, who did not yet know which, only tipped her hat and kept riding. So here she was, 18 when they ran her out, 22 when she came back, and the deed to a cursed ranch folded against her heart for the price of a hot meal. What made her spend her last $2 on a place the whole town called poisoned? What did the powerful family that once owned it want so badly to bury there? And why did the old woman on the church steps look at Jane as if she had seen a ghost walk home? If this is your kind of story, stay with us. Leave a comment telling us where you're riding in from, and subscribe so you don't miss what she finds under the floorboards. Because the ranch had been waiting a long time, and it knew her name. The ridge road climbed slow out of Dry Creek, and Jane did not push the mare. She let the animal find its own pace, hooves ticking against the loose shale, and behind her the laughter of the men on the boardwalk thinned into wind and then into nothing at all. She could still hear the shape of it, though, the way a bell keeps ringing in the ear after the rope has gone still. Girl, graveyard, rattlesnakes, and rot. She had known the tall man's laugh before she had known his face. It belonged to the kind of man who had never once been told no by the land or by anyone standing on it. At the edge of the mercantile, 2 women in aprons stopped their sweeping to watch her pass. One of them leaned to the other and said something behind her hand. The other laughed, short and sharp, then covered her mouth. A boy ran alongside the mare for 20 paces and shouted, "You gonna dig up bones, miss?" before an older brother caught him by the collar and yanked him back. A man loading grain outside the feed store spat into the dust and shook his head. Jane kept her eyes on the ridge. She had spent 4 years learning how to carry other people's opinions the way a mule carries a pack, evenly, without shifting, so nothing rubbed a sore. She did not turn her head. She did not straighten her back. She rode. Near the last house before the road opened into rangeland, the old woman from the church steps was waiting. She stood beside a low stone wall with her hands folded over the head of a hickory cane, and her shawl was the color of ash. Jane had never known her name, only that she had been old already when Jane was a child, and that she had once brought a jar of honey to Jane's mother when Jane's father had been carried home the last time. Jane slowed the mare. The old woman did not step forward. She only lifted her chin a little and looked up at Jane with eyes that had gone milk pale at the edges. "Child," she said. "Ma'am?" The old woman studied her a moment. Then she said, quiet and even, as if reciting something she had held in her mouth for years. "What they buried shallow." Jane waited for more. None came. The old woman's lips pressed closed and her hands tightened once on the cane. "Ma'am, go on now," the old woman said. "The wind's turning." Jane touched the brim of her hat. She wanted to ask 100 things, but a knowing came over her that questions would not be answered today, and might not be answered by this woman at all. She nudged the mare forward. When she looked back once, the old woman was still standing at the wall, watching her go, small and gray against the whitewash. Behind her, hooves came up the road at a canter. Jane did not stop, but she loosened her hand on the rein. The tall man from the boardwalk pulled his horse alongside hers. A good bay, 17 hands, sleek as polished walnut. Up close, his coat was finer still, dark wool with bone buttons, and a silver band on his hat that caught the sun. "Ashby," he said, as if she had asked. "Merrick Ashby. I run cattle north of the creek now. Used to be Halloran country. All of it." He gestured wide with one gloved hand, taking in the whole of the visible world. "All of it but that 1,000 acres you just paid $2 for." Jane said nothing. "I'll give you 5, he said. "Right now. 2.5 times what you paid. You ride back to the courthouse, sign it over, and you leave Dry Creek with money in your pocket instead of dust in your teeth." He smiled a wide, easy smile. "That's a kindness, girl. I'm offering you a kindness." "No, thank you," Jane said. His smile did not change, but something behind it did. He touched his hat. "Suit yourself. When you come back down that road in a week begging for supper, I'll remember I offered." He wheeled the bay and cantered back toward town, and the dust of him hung in the road a long time. Jane rode on. The sun was already tipping west, and the ridge ahead had gone the color of dried blood in the late light, and somewhere out past it, waiting, was 1,000 acres of ground the whole town had agreed to forget. She reached the gate at the blue hour, when the sky was neither day nor night, and the land held its breath between them. The gate itself was down. One post rotted through at the base, the crossbar tangled in cheatgrass. A brand had been burned into the wood a long time ago, but weather had scoured it until only a ghost of the shape remained. Jane dismounted and led the mare through on foot. The road up to the house was a suggestion more than a road. Sage had grown into it. A jackrabbit broke from a bush and vanished. She walked a 1/4 mile before the house came into view, and when it did, she stopped, and the mare stopped behind her. And for a long moment, neither of them moved. The house sagged. That was the first word. It sagged at the porch, at the ridgepole, at one whole corner where the foundation stones had slipped. The windows were dark, most of them broken, one boarded with a plank nailed at a wrong angle. The barn beyond it leaned worse than the church in town. A corral fence had fallen into itself. A well stood in the yard, with its rope gone and its cover cracked. Everything was the color of driftwood. Everything had waited. Jane stood there until the last of the blue drained out of the sky. Then she led the mare to what was left of the corral, tied her where a rail still held, and unbuckled the saddle. She carried her bedroll to the porch. The porch boards groaned under her weight, but held. She did not go inside. Not yet. Not in the dark. She sat with her back against the wall of the house, and the deed folded against her chest. And she ate the last of the hardtack in her saddlebag, chewing slow. An owl called once from the barn. The mare shifted and blew. Somewhere in the boards behind her, a mouse ran along a joist and stopped. Jane listened. The house was not silent. It settled and ticked and breathed the way old wood does when the day's heat leaves it. It sounded, she thought, almost like a thing turning over in its sleep. She lay down on the bedroll with her coat pulled tight and her hat over her face, and she did not sleep for a long time. When she finally did, it was to the sound of something under the floor. Not a mouse, not the wind. A slow, patient creak, as if the house were setting a place at a table for someone who had finally come home. Jane woke at first light with frost on her coat and the taste of iron in her mouth. The mare was watching her from the corral, ears forward, as if the mare had been awake longer and knew things. Jane sat up slow. The porch was silver with dew. The eastern sky had begun to pink along the ridge, and the house behind her, in that pale wash, looked less like a ruin and more like a thing that had simply been waiting. She stood, stretched the stiffness out of her back, and pushed the front door open with her shoulder. The hinges gave without much argument. Inside smelled of dust, mouse, and something older beneath it. The faint sweetness of pine sap dried in the walls for 30 summers. The main room ran the length of the house. A stone hearth stood at one end, black inside, with a cast-iron kettle tipped on its side in the ash. A plank table with 2 chairs. A cupboard with its doors hanging open on one hinge each. In the far corner, a narrow bed with the ticking chewed through in a dozen places. Jane walked the room slowly. Her boots made a hollow sound on the floorboards, the sound a body makes crossing a bridge. She stopped in the middle of the room and stood still, listening. The house made small noises. None of them were the noise she had heard in the night. She crossed to the hearth. She ran her hand along the mantel, a single beam of dark wood, thick as her thigh, blackened at the underside from years of smoke. Her fingers caught on something, a notch, cut clean. She bent to see it. Not a burn, not a crack. A letter, an H carved deep, the way a man carves who means for the mark to outlast him. Beside it, a second letter, half hidden by soot. She rubbed her thumb across it. A W. Jane pulled her hand back. Walker, her own name. Cut into the mantel of a house that had, by every account she had ever heard, belonged to a family named Halloran. She stood at the hearth a long time. Her breath came shallow. She thought of her father, whom she had not thought of in a straight line for 8 years, and of the box Merrick Ashby had spoken of on the boardwalk. She thought of the old woman by the stone wall saying, "What they buried shallow." She did not act on it. She did not pry at the mantel or start pulling boards. Something in her, older than her 22 years, told her that the house had kept its secret this long and would keep it another day. She stepped back from the hearth. She walked to the window and looked out at the mare, who had lowered her head to crop what dry grass the corral still held. Outside, on the porch step, Jane sat and unfolded the deed and read her own name written in the clerk's careful hand. She folded it again and put it against her chest. Then she looked at the sagging barn, the fallen corral, the well without its rope, and she began, in her mind, to make a list. The list was long. She did not let that stop her. She had learned in Cheyenne that a long list becomes short if a person only picks up one thing at a time. She began that morning with the corral. She walked the fallen rails end to end and set aside the ones that had rot in them and stacked the ones that were sound. There were more sound rails than she had expected. Someone long ago had used good pine and set the posts deep. By midday, she had rebuilt 8 feet of fence with nothing but her hands, a rock for a mallet, and the wire she cut from a rusted spool inside the barn. The mare watched. When Jane paused to drink from her canteen, the mare came to the new rail and pressed her nose against it, as if testing the work, and then blew softly and went back to grazing. That afternoon, Jane cleared the well. She lowered her belt with the buckle tied to a stone and drew up water the color of weak tea, which she poured on the ground until it ran clear. By the time the sun sat on the ridge, she had water she could boil. She built a small fire in the yard from broken corral rail and set the kettle from the hearth on 2 flat stones. The kettle had a hairline crack down one side. She turned the crack away from the fire, and it held. She slept the second night inside, on the floor by the hearth, with the mare's saddle blanket over her and her coat rolled under her head. She heard the creak again just before dawn, and this time she marked where it came from. Beneath the boards, toward the west wall. She lay still and listened until it stopped, and then she slept again until light. The next morning, she started on the barn. The doors had sagged off their top hinges, and she lifted them one at a time, set them square, and drove the pins back with the flat of an axe head she had found rusted into the chopping block. Inside the barn was a workbench, a broken plow, a coil of harness leather stiffened to iron, and, in the far stall, a rope halter hung on a peg with the initials burned into the leather browband, the same H, the same W. Jane took the halter down. The leather was cracked, but sound. She oiled it that evening with tallow scraped from the bottom of her saddlebag and worked it slow between her palms until it softened. The mare stood for her while she slipped it on. It fit as if it had been cut for her. Days passed like that. Jane rose with the light and worked until the light went. She patched the roof of the house with cedar shakes she split from a fallen tree at the edge of the pasture. She scythed the cheat grass back from the yard with a rusted blade she had honed on a river stone. She mended the cupboard door. She fixed the broken pane in the kitchen window with oiled paper and lath. Each task uncovered another small thing that did not fit. A brand iron in the tack room, its mark not the Halloran H, but a joined H and W, laid over each other like linked hands. A row of nails driven into the barn beam at eye height, spaced exactly a hand's width apart, 7 of them, as if to hang 7 of something now gone. A ledger scrap in the bottom of the cupboard, no cover, 3 pages, columns of numbers in a woman's hand, and at the bottom of the last page, a single line. Paid in full to J. Walker, Spring. The date had been torn away. Jane read the line 3 times. Then she folded the scrap and put it inside the deed, and put the deed back against her chest. She did not yet know what she was building. Her hands were learning it before her mind. Every board she straightened, every rail she set, every knot she tied in the mended halter. The house seemed to lean a little less. The mare grew calmer. The creak beneath the floor came almost every night now, always toward the west wall, always at the same hour, as if something under the boards were keeping time with her breath. On the 9th night, Jane took a lantern to the west wall. She had waited long enough. The creak came just after the owl called from the barn, the way it always did, and this time she was ready. She set the lantern on the floor and knelt beside it. The boards along the west wall ran the length of the room, wide pine planks, dark with age and boot polish and lamp smoke. She pressed her palm flat against each one in turn, working from the corner outward, and on the 4th board from the wall she felt it give beneath her hand, a small breath of movement no wider than a pencil. She fetched the axe head from the barn. She worked the flat of it into the seam and lifted. The board came up whole, dry, and light in her hands, as if it had been meant to lift. Beneath it, in the crawl between the floor and the earth, was a tin box the size of a bread loaf, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark. Jane sat back on her heels. She did not reach for it. She looked at it in the lantern light and let her breath slow. Then she reached in with both hands and drew it up. The oilcloth cracked when she peeled it back. The tin beneath was army green, its lid stamped with a maker's mark she did not know, its hinges rusted shut but the clasp still working. She thumbed the clasp. The lid opened with a small, dry sigh. Inside, folded on top, was a woman's handkerchief with the initials M.W. embroidered in blue thread at one corner. Jane's mother had been Mary Walker. Jane held the handkerchief in the lantern light for a long moment and did not cry. She set it aside. Beneath the handkerchief lay a leather notebook, palm-sized, its cover stained dark at one corner in a shape Jane did not want to name. She opened it. The pages were filled in her father's hand. She knew his hand from a single Christmas card kept in her mother's Bible. Small, careful, slanted right. Dates ran down the left margin. Numbers ran down the right. In between were names of cattle, numbers of head, prices, and the initial A beside every entry. Ashby. The last date in the book was written in a hand that trembled. Beside it, her father had written, "Told him I would not sign. Told him the land was not his to take. He said then it will be no one's." Jane closed the notebook. She sat still on the floor for a long time. Beneath the notebook was a folded paper, brittle at the creases. She opened it under the lantern. It was a deed, older than the one against her chest, made out in her grandfather's name. Halloran on the mother's side, Walker on the father's, the two names joined by marriage on a line she had never seen written down. The 1,000 acres had been her family's before it had been anyone else's. The joined H and W on the brand iron in the barn had not been decoration. It had been a fact. Under the deed, at the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a second square of oilcloth, was a small revolver with 1 chamber fired and 5 still loaded, and beside it a lock of dark hair tied with a black ribbon. Jane closed the tin. She put the lid down slowly, as if it were a sleeping thing. She sat with her hands flat on the closed lid, and she understood, without needing to say it, why her father had come home in a box, why her mother had been run out with a child, why the town had laughed at $2 for 1,000 acres, and why the old woman by the stone wall had said what she had said. She sat until the lantern guttered. Then she wrapped the tin in her coat and slept with it beside her on the floor. The wind turned that night. Jane felt it before she woke. By dawn, the sky over the ridge had gone the color of wet slate, and by mid-morning, the first flakes were coming sideways across the pasture, though it was still weeks too early for snow. A late storm, the kind that killed cattle out of season and travelers who trusted the calendar. Jane brought the mare into the barn and forked her the last of the dry grass from the loft. She banked the fire in the hearth. She set the tin under a loose stone in the chimney base and mortared it back with mud from the yard. She had just finished when she heard the dog. It came first as a thin, ragged bark somewhere past the gate, then a second bark closer, and then silence. Jane took her coat off the peg and went out into the weather. The snow was thick enough now to soften the shapes of the corral rails. Halfway down the overgrown road she found them. A woman on foot leading a spent horse. A child of maybe 6 wrapped in a shawl against the woman's hip. And a black dog with 1 white foot circling them and barking at nothing and everything. "Come," Jane said. It was all she said. The woman did not argue. She followed Jane back up the road, the child's face pressed against her neck, the horse stumbling on legs gone stiff. Jane got them into the house, set the woman by the hearth, wrapped the child in the saddle blanket, and went back out for the horse. She led it into the barn beside the mare and rubbed it down with a twist of dry grass until it stopped shivering. By the time she came back to the house, the woman had found her voice. She was traveling to her sister in the next county, she said. The stage had gone through 2 days ago without her. A man in Dry Creek had told her the ridge road was passable. He had told her also, she said with her eyes on the fire, that the woman up here would turn her away. He was wrong, Jane said. The woman looked at her. Ashby, she said. That was the name. Jane put more wood on the fire. She set the kettle on. She did not answer. Outside, the storm rose to a howl, and the house creaked in every joint, and the wind came in under the door in a thin white line of snow that Jane stepped over as she moved between the hearth and the cupboard. The child slept. The woman slept, sitting up. Jane did not sleep. She sat by the fire with the notebook in her lap and read every page by the low red light, and by the time the storm broke near dawn, she had decided what she would do. She would not run. She would not sell. She would not carry the tin to the courthouse in the morning like a woman asking to be believed. She would finish the house. She would finish the barn. She would put cattle back on her family's grass, and when the town was ready to look, the truth would already be standing on its own 4 legs in the yard, waiting. The storm passed by mid-morning and left the ridge white and quiet. The traveler woke to the smell of coffee boiled from grounds Jane had scraped from the bottom of a tin, and the child woke to a bowl of the last of the hardtack softened in water. They ate slowly. When the sun was high enough to melt the road, Jane saddled the traveler's horse, set the woman and the child upon it, and walked them the 4 miles down to the fork where the county road met the ridge. She would not take payment. The woman looked back once from the saddle and said, "I will tell them." Jane touched the mare's halter and turned home. She did not know yet how far the woman would tell it. By the end of that week, a wagon came up the ridge road with a bay team and a man on the bench who wore a gray coat and spectacles. He was the county surveyor from 2 towns over, sent, he said, on a plain matter of record. He had heard from a woman lodging at his sister's house that a young woman on the old Halloran place had put a lost traveler by her fire in a storm that had killed 2 head of stock down valley. He had heard also, in the same telling, of a joined brand and a name that did not match the county rolls. He was a careful man. He asked to see what she had. Jane brought out the tin from beneath the chimney stone. He read the notebook without speaking for nearly an hour, turned the older deed in the light, and set both down on the plank table with the care of a man handling glass. "Miss Walker," he said quietly, "this is your land. It has been your land." He said he would file what needed filing. He said it plainly, the way a doctor names a bone. Word travels on a ridge road faster than a rider. Within days, an older lawyer rode up from the county seat, unasked, and stood on the porch with his hat in both hands. He had known her grandfather, he said. He had wondered all these years at the shape of the sail. He offered his hand and his service, and he named no fee. A cattleman from the north brought 4 heifers up the road in a borrowed wagon, and asked only that Jane pay him back in a calf when she could. The old woman from the stone wall walked the whole 4 miles up the ridge one afternoon, with a jar of honey in her shawl, set it on the plank table, and looked once at the mantel where the H and the soot-hidden W stood side by side. "Your mother knew," she said. "She was waiting for you to be old enough to know too." Then she walked back down. Merrick Ashby came last. He rode up alone on the 17-hand bay, and he did not dismount for a long while. When he finally stepped down, the silver band on his hat caught the low sun and threw it into the dust. He stood at the porch step and did not speak first. Jane waited. "I heard the surveyor came," he said at last. Jane said she supposed he had. He looked out at the 4 heifers grazing where the corral had been mended, at the barn doors squared on their hinges, at the mare in the halter with the burned initials. Something in his face went slack, not broken, only tired. The way a man looks when a long lie he has carried finally sets itself down of its own weight. "Your father was a better man than me," he said. "I knew it then. He did not ask forgiveness. He mounted the bay and rode back down the ridge, and the town, when he passed through it, watched him go with the same silence it had once used to watch Jane arrive. By the end of that season, the pasture carried 20 head. The house stood square on its foundation stones. The barn doors closed true. A second brand iron, cut fresh at the forge in town by a smith who would not take her coin, hung on the tackroom peg beside the old joined H and W, and the new iron carried the same 2 letters, cleaner, deeper, meant to last another 100 years. The road up the ridge was no longer overgrown. Children from the town rode up on Sundays to see the heifers, and their mothers came behind them with baskets, and the old woman from the stone wall was carried up once in a wagon and sat on the porch in the sun for a whole afternoon, and did not speak, and did not need to. On an evening in late autumn, at the golden hour, Jane stood at the mended gate with the mare beside her, and looked back across the 1,000 acres. The light came low across the grass and turned the ridge the color of beaten copper. The cattle were moving toward the creek in a slow, dark line. The house behind her threw a long, clean shadow. The joined brand on the gatepost had been recut and stood plain against the wood. She thought of her mother in the room above the laundry 200 miles away, and of her father in a box he did not choose, and of a boy on a fence post who had run to tell the town a ghost had come home. She thought of 2 paper dollars folded soft as cloth against her chest. The old lawyer had asked her, a week before, what she meant to call the place now that the deed was clean. She had not answered him then. She answered now, aloud, to the mare and the wind and no one else. "It was never a graveyard," she said. "It was a promise somebody kept." The mare flicked one ear and lowered her head to the grass. The sun slid another finger toward the ridge. Jane laid her hand flat on the top rail of the gate, felt the grain of the wood her own hands had planed, and stood there until the light went blue. She had come back with $2 and a borrowed coat. She had bought 1,000 acres of what the town called rot. She had found her name burned into the beam of a house that was never not hers, and she had put cattle back on her family's grass, and she had done it without raising her voice once. What the world dismissed had held, all along, the thing the world most needed to remember. She turned the mare toward the barn and walked her home in the last of the light. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. If Jane's long, quiet walk back to her own name moved you, leave a like, tell us in the comments where you were watching from, and subscribe so the next story finds you. Settle in soon for another, a widower, a wounded stallion nobody would touch, and a mountain pass that only one of them was meant to cross. Until then, ride easy.